chill.
Guys, it's a new year, so that means new concepts and initiatives for this channel, one of which being top fact lists, because I don't know about you, but I love a good list. So based on what I've done previously in the day or the previous video, I'm going to do a fact list to go with it. So right now, today's recipient of the facts is the Hellspawn himself. Guys, these are 15 mind-blowing facts about Spawn. This first one is just a fun little tidbit bit of information. Todd McFarlane released some early concept sketches of the Spawn design, and this is going back to like when he was a teenager. Like, he'd had Spawn in mind for a long time. It wasn't just like a whim when he was working at Marvel. And you can see how the character has evolved from the sketches. You've got kind of that basic kind of Spawn design, but you can see he was going for way more of a kind of a sci-fi kind of look with blues and greys and the brightly colored eyes. I think maybe, I don't want to get into the mind of Todd McFarlane, who can besides Todd? But the early stages of Spawn looked way more tech and sci-fi than they did Demons and Hell. Fact number 14 is that the early issues of Todd McFarlane's Spawn comic were actually printed out of order. For some bizarre reason, issues 19 and 20 were released after issues that should have come out after them. Basically, issue 19, I believe, came out between like 23 and 24, and like, issue 20 came out between like, I think, off of 26. Either way, like, it was a real mismatch, and that was incredibly confusing because the Spawn story, if you haven't actually read the early Spawn McFarlane stories, they are bizarre. Like, McFarlane goes way off the reservation, dealing with hell and heaven and angels and demons and other planes of existence and time skips, and oh, it's not surprising that, reading the issues out of order actually probably wasn't that different to reading them in order. But there was never any explanation given officially as to why issues 19 and 20 got bumped around for some reason and the order was all messed up. And to be honest, the basic sort of theory is that Image Comics was a young upstart company run by a bunch of braggadocious people, and they just darn missed their deadlines. Our next fact is that it is bonkers how powerful Spawn actually is. And this is almost a bit of a problem with writing sometimes, is that he has, what you would call the Eric Cartman Bullrug effect, where it's like, Bullrug has the power to have many powers. So Spawn is basically like the power of the devil incarnate. So he can do just about anything. And McFarlane tried to temper this in the early issues by having like a counter, a meter of strength. And the idea was, once he has exhausted all of his powers, he will get sucked back down to hell for good, which was why Spawn would often use machine guns and grenades and bombs. It was kind of cool. Like, he was a demon, but he actually had all this military weaponry. It was a very cool visual aesthetic. I mean, who wouldn't love like a badass demon with huge guns? That's the most 90s thing in the world. But eventually it was kind of established that really Spawn's power levels are entirely down to his imagination. So whenever you have one of those who would beat who in a fight, yeah, it would definitely be Spawn. Unless it's Batman with enough time to prepare. Speaking of Batman, our next fact involves the Dark Knight himself and an image change for Spawn, which was kind of curious. There was a crossover, put my teeth in. There was a crossover, shall we try that again? I'm not going to edit it. There was a crossover between Spawn and Batman. And during that fight, Spawn takes a batarang to the face, which is interesting considering how many batarangs Batman throws. The one guy who he actually hits in the face is the one who can't die from it. Whew. That was lucky. But, Spawn removes the batarang and he has this huge big gash in his face, and he has the ability, the power to just heal up his face. But for some reason, he chooses not to. Instead, he gets like an old shoestring and laces up the front of his face. And it was kind of stated that he sort of did this because he didn't want to reveal the full extent of his power. He wanted to maintain some humanity by being like, I'm still human. I need to stitch myself up to recover. Dude, you ain't fooling no one. Have you looked in the mirror? Now, going over to one of my other loves, we have video games and Spawn's appearance in Soul Calibur 2. This was back in the time where each console had their own exclusive character. So you had a playable Link on the Nintendo one at the time, GameCube maybe? And then on the PlayStation, you had Heihachi Mishima. And then for the Xbox, you had Spawn. And the reason for this was they couldn't really get any iconic Xbox characters. They couldn't work out a deal to use the Halo Master Chief guy. And then basically they were like, I don't know who else to do. So they went for Spawn. But of course, they had to remove his cape because the animators were like, yeah, we're not doing that. Next up is the reason why Spawn is all burnt and charred and Freddy Kruegered under his mask, and that is because Todd McFarlane wanted to make a black superhero. He felt that there wasn't enough sort of mainstream recognition of, cool superheroic black characters, so he wanted to make a black hero. The problem was, he didn't want people to focus entirely on his race, which unfortunately you knew was going to be a thing like in the 90s, and, because racism is over now, but what he wanted to do was still maintain the heritage of the character while not having it be so kind of like a topic of conversation. Hence, Spawn was burnt to a crisp. So even without his mask, his horrific features actually make him identifiable for everyone. Look at that. Terrible, horrible trauma just, brings us all together. Now, this fact might just blow your minds for a second, but did you know that there were Spawn toys? I know, right? But interestingly, this was, something that blew the toy market wide open when it came to adult collectibles, because originally it was going to be Mattel that were going to make Spawn toys, but unsurprisingly, Todd McFarlane couldn't come to a deal with Mattel as to how they were going to go about doing it. I mean, the whole point of launching Image Comics was the fact that the creators got to create the way they wanted to create. And Mattel were like, you want to have how many severed heads with this character? It was never going to work. So of course, that caused McFarlane to make McFarlane Toys. Originally going to be called Todd's Toys, I think, or something other kind of innocuous kind of name. Ultimately, he went with McFarlane Toys, and the rest is history. Our next fact is that God is a reoccurring character in the Spawn comics. For those of you who are not that familiar with Spawn, of course it's all about heaven and hell, and God features prominently. Maybe he's depicted slightly more favorably than in, say, Preacher, but not by much. In fact, at one point, it is revealed there is an even higher power than God himself, and that character turns God and the devil into children to teach them some humility. He actually turns them into Al and Wanda's children. So it's God is not the highest power in the Spawn universe, and he's had some weird interactions with those characters. Our next fact involves a young man by the name of Will Carlton. Who's Will Carlton, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. He's the guy who founded Image Comics and created Spawn. No, Dave, what are you talking about? That's Todd McFarlane, you idiot. I can hear you tapping away in the comments. Let me stop you there, because Will Carlton is Todd McFarlane. For whatever reason, in the mid-90s, Todd McFarlane decided to step away from writing Spawn, and a young man by the name of Will Carlton took over, which was, of course, a nom de plume of Todd himself. I think I can imagine, if I can step into his headspace, being one genius to another, I'm sure it's comparable. Todd decided that maybe he wanted to see how people reacted to his work or reviewed it when they didn't know it was his. So instead, he changed to a different pen name and wrote about 20 issues of Spawn under this Will Carlton name, which is not that unusual. All sorts of authors, Stephen King, I know, has a different pen name. They'll do this to see how their work is interpreted by an audience that don't have the preconceived expectations of who they are. It's an interesting little thing. A really quick little info tidbit, this one, is just that Todd McFarlane likes to name his characters after real people in his life. So I believe that Al was the name of his college roommate, maybe, and then Wanda, Terry Fitzgerald, at least the first names, were all people who Todd has either been related to or had friendships with or interacted with in his life, and I don't know, maybe he projects a little bit of their personality into the characters, considering what the characters are like that he writes. I hope not. Speaking of using people's real names, Todd McFarlane got himself into a little bit of hot water. It's almost like he was a NECA figure that you wanted to articulate. So he called a character of his Tony Twist, and this character was a vile mobster, a real evil piece of work. Unfortunately, that didn't really sit well with the real Tony Twist, a guy who was a professional hockey player, one of those people who can afford some high-priced lawyers, and he took Todd McFarlane to court and was like, dude, you've totally taken my name. I want some money. And it turns out he got quite a bit of money. He was originally awarded, I do believe, $15 million, which is a little steep. But Todd McFarlane said, look, to get $15 million, I'm going to have to look down the back of like 3 couches for that money. I might have to sell one of my baseballs. Could you sweeten the deal a bit? And eventually he got it down to $5 million. So Todd had to just like rummage down the back of one couch and be like, there you go, $5 million. All right, next up might be my favorite fact, and it involves Neil Gaiman and creator rights. The whole point of Image Comics was that the creators were tired of creating characters and then having Marvel own those characters. So they said, if you work for us, whatever you create belongs to you. So Neil Gaiman wrote Spawn, and he created some really cool characters. And basically, when he left and Todd McFarlane took over, Todd was like, well, these are my characters. You made them in my comic. And Neil's like, nah, that's not the way it works. So Todd was like, well, I'm gonna make my own characters that just happen to look and sound and act exactly like your characters. And again, Neil Gaiman was like, nah, not how it works. So ultimately, Neil Gaiman, they had this little lawsuit. Gaiman won the rights to his character, and eventually, funnily enough, which baffled the hell out of me, he sold the rights to one of the characters, Angela, to Marvel Comics. And of course, Angela in Marvel Comics is now like Thor's sister, I believe, and one of the Guardians of the Galaxy, but she originated in a Spawn comic, which I didn't know how that worked. I just saw Angela turn up on a Marvel cover. I was like, but how? But that's really cool. Speaking of character creator controversies, the original assassin who killed Al Simmons was a guy named Chapel, and he was created by Rob Liefeld over in Rob Liefeld's Image Comics. And they wanted to have a similar sort of Marvel Universe, shared universe kind of thing, so Todd was like, I'm gonna have Liefeld's character be the guy who kills my character. That's a good little crossover. What's the worst that can happen? Of course, we get the Spawn movie, which is the answer to what's the worst that can happen in most questions. But in that movie, they're like, okay, well, we need to use this Chapel character, but we don't want to pay Rob Liefeld for the use. That guy sucks. He can't even draw feet. So instead, they were like, yeah, you know what? Let's just change it. So instead, Chapel becomes priest. So they keep the little biblical sort of church theme there. And instead of the male Chapel, there is a female assassin called Priest who murders Al Simmons in the movie. And then subsequently in comic books, she's also the one who kills him, I think. Speaking of the Spawn movie, they had an interesting corporate tie-in sort of sponsor type thing. In 1992, McDonald's got in some serious hot water for promoting Happy Meal action figures of the Batman Returns characters. And if you've seen Batman Returns, of course you have. It is dark. Like, that's not a kid's film. And McDonald's took the heat for that. But in 1997, Taco Bell were like, hold my beer. We want a satanic hellspawn demon to promote our food. Luckily though, Taco Bell is not geared towards children. It's geared towards mostly stoners, I think. So that was not a problem. You had all these adverts in 1997, or commercials if you will, of the little Taco Bell dog and interactions with the demonic hellspawn to promote, I don't know, burritos? And for our final fact, the answer is Will Smith, Cuba Gooding Jr., and Snoop Dogg. Bam. Which actors were considered for the role of Spawn? That's right, yes, before Michael J. White was cast, who actually I think was one of the best parts of that Spawn movie. Michael J. White's just badass. I think that guy's awesome. But before he got the role, those 3 guys were considered. Snoop Dogg apparently was considered for the role, and apparently according to him, he actually read for it. So, you know, I'm not going to cast any shade on Snoop Dogg either. I like Snoop Dogg. I mean, hell, he's on the AEW roster. Why wouldn't you? He did the world's worst frog splash this week. So according to Snoop, which I will take as gospel, he read and was considered for the role of Spawn in 1997. He's got the hype, but I think you have to fill out a little bit more. And that does it, folks, for the 15 random facts about Spawn. Guys, what did you think of this little facts list? Do you enjoy these things? Comment below, let me know. What other facts about Spawn do you think are worth including? Because Lord knows, we could go on all day with this crazy character. But guys, until next time, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time, and until then, keep displaying model behavior. Cheers.